just now. There we go. I think it's working now. Okay, thanks everybody for joining us today. Welcome to everybody. There's still some people coming in, but we're going to get started. So if I could ask people if you could mute your microphones while you're not speaking, so that make sure we can hear the speakers as well as possible. The format of the session will be each of our speakers will speak for about 15-20 minutes, and then after that we'll have time for Q&A. So please do, throughout the talks, if a question comes to your mind, please do use the chat function to put any questions that come to your mind as they're speaking, and then at the end we'll pick up any questions we've got in the chat, or at that stage you might want to put up your hand as well. We're a small enough group that we can put up our hands to speak as well. Chance to do that if they wish. For those who do not know me, my name is Elaine Mulcahy. I'm the director of the UK Health Alliance and Climate Change, and we've been running these lunchtime sessions for just over a year now. We started them back in April last year, and we've covered a whole range of activities, or a whole range of subjects. But only very recently has the UK Health Alliance started to really think about biodiversity and nature and the impacts of biodiversity loss and nature loss on human health. Focus has very much been on climate change, but actually we've come to realize that actually biodiversity and nature loss is an area that we need to be much more proactive on as well, and we're doing some work on that. Without nature, we have nothing. They were the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at Biodiversity COP15 that was held last year. And although without nature we are nothing, right now biodiversity and nature are declining at their fastest rate in human history. And those losses are a direct consequence of human interference in the natural world. So our oceans are a major part of the natural world that we rely on for our health and well-being, and yet they're being damaged by our human activities. Clean water, for example, is fundamental to human health, but pollution is damaging water quality, leading in rises to waterborne diseases. Acidification of the oceans due to excess levels of greenhouse gases and heat are harming marine life. The impacts of many implications for human health, from food insecurity, discovery of new medicines, exacerbation of asthma, and physical and mental well-being. So my knowledge on this subject is limited, and so I'm very pleased to be able to welcome three expert speakers from Healthcare Ocean and the One Health Breakthrough Partnership today, who are going to highlight the importance of our oceans for our health and the important relationship between healthcare and the ocean. So to kick us off, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Georgie Howson, who's a GP from North East England and one of the co-founders of Healthcare Ocean. And Georgie's going to then take us through and follow on with Richard and Sharon. So over to you, Georgie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elaine, and welcome to World Ocean Day. In this session, we'll be discussing the crucial role between oceans and human health, and the enormous opportunity that we have now to move forward as healthcare professionals and organisations in the move to a more sustainable future in which oceans and water systems are not left behind. I'm a GP and I'm currently working in the northeast of England. I spend my time outside of work in the North Sea, which I'm featuring in my slides today so that we can get a sense of connection to ocean. Because a reminder that we may sometimes feel a million miles away from the sea if we're inland, indoors, but with ocean and indeed with nature, everything is connected, whether it's through the rivers, lakes or streams, or even the sink or drain in our consultation room. We may be joining today's conference from many different places, but we're connected by one ocean. And because of this interconnectivity, and because of the rapidly changing landscape or seascape for businesses and other industries in addressing nature loss, before handing over to Richard and Sharon, I'm going to explore ocean health in the context of the wider threats and opportunities relating to biodiversity across all ecosystems at land and at sea. And I am thrilled as a clinician to be part of the first healthcare system that has developed an ambitious roadmap to net zero carbon, we've seen how quickly and successfully net zero and carbon strategies for healthcare have become mainstream through the incredible work of so many organisations and individuals. And this has included development of sustainability plans for our hospital trusts, integrated care boards, some primary care organisations. And we've also seen integration of sustainable health education, both at under and postgraduate level, but also in frameworks.
Sorry to interrupt. We can't see your slides.
Okay.
I don't think you've shared your screen. I'm sorry. Sorry to
No.
interrupt you there. I think we're waiting for you to put
We're waiting for you to start. Oh no, sorry about that. It's saying error, cannot share screen. Let me try again. Window. Okay, share. Can you see the slides now?
Yes, they're coming up now, yeah.
Okay, what I'm going to do is just go into full screen. Can you see that now, Elaine?
Yes, we can. Yeah, we're on Healthier Planet, Healthier People.
Perfect. Well, we've missed a few, but that was okay. It was more just setting the scene and trying to connect us there to the North Sea through our different mechanisms and different water systems that we might be near today. So this has included the development of sustainability plans for our hospital trusts, integrated care boards and primary care organisations, and also through education and in the frameworks that can influence who we work with. However, we cannot meet net zero healthcare or the sustainable development goals without a thriving nature or oceans. The UK is one of the most nature-deprived countries in the world, but our food, health and economy depend on healthy natural environments, and yet globally ecosystems are at risk of collapse, with a devastating 1 million species in land and sea at risk of extinction. COP15 in Montreal in December last year heralded 4 overarching goals, which include targets to protect 30% of the planet for nature by 2030, reform £410 billion of environmentally damaging subsidies, and restore 30% of the planet's degraded terrestrial, inland water, and coastal and marine ecosystems. But as well as needing global commitment and policy change that we can advocate for through healthcare, unlike carbon, nature is also very place-based and very personal. And of the 23 recommendations listed, healthcare systems can have a unique opportunity to play a part, as we'll hear on number 7 through Richard and through Sharon around pollution. Also things like shipping procurement with the impact of invasive species transfer, thinking about our food consumption and halving food waste by 2030, and making sure that there is equity throughout. We also heard recently in one of the talks by Tony Jupiter about how healthcare can advocate to improve area and quality of urban, blue and green spaces. And of course, key to all of this is number 14, which is integrating biodiversity into policies and development across all sectors. So, a recent analysis of more than 650 corporate sustainability initiatives in other industries in the last 2 decades revealed that only 6% relate to biodiversity, and of these, only 4% were designed to address biodiversity decline in water-based habitats. And this ties in with the mapping that we've done in sustainability plans and education in the UK. Biodiversity, and particularly oceans, are not always mentioned, and oftentimes this might be in how we might benefit from nature without discussing our impact. And whilst many institutions have declared climate emergencies, we only managed to find 1 medical college to have declared both a climate and a nature emergency. But elsewhere in other industries, these challenges are starting to be addressed. Last month, 12 corporations announced their intentions to set targets for nature using science-based target network. And later this year, financial institutions and businesses will have the new global framework to measure and disclose their nature risks and opportunities through the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. So why should healthcare address this? Well, like other industries, healthcare benefits considerably from the ecosystem services that nature and ocean provides. But our relationship with nature and ocean goes far deeper from this. From every other breath we take, to the development of new drugs, bioplastics, transportation for the 80% of goods we use in our UK healthcare systems, to opportunities to our patients' mental and physical health through time spent in natural spaces. And we are likely as an industry to have a significant nature and ocean footprint. We have substantial interfaces with nature. This can be locally, for instance, in the presence of pharmaceutical pollution in UK rivers, to microplastics from tyres or laundry washing, to chemicals and development of healthcare estate. And also globally, for instance, in our supply chains through pharmaceutical production or shipping procurement. And we do not yet have the data needed to be certain of our nature or oceanic footprint in the same way that we can for carbon, but we can start to talk about it. And there are also the potential co-benefits for climate, nature, and ocean health that can be generated directly from person-centered, population-based healthcare that listens to what matters most to patients, or from advocating for improved access to green infrastructure, or collaborating with local nature recovery strategies to improve natural capital and biodiversity on NHS estate. And crucially, what makes healthcare systems different is that we know healthy oceans and natural systems can only be addressed by including these relationships with our patients and populations, by listening and respecting the knowledge of communities and advocating for equity. We formed Healthcare Ocean a few years ago with my colleagues Professor Laura Fleming and Dr. Richard Hickson, and we aimed not to distract or complicate the strong and successful drive to net zero carbon, but instead to strengthen this by advocating and educating around nature and ocean, and to do this through collaboration at every level. But it's been slow progress, and we've now had to add to these aims the integration into existing strategy education, because that is how we will move forward through strengthening and collaboration. But there are many challenges, and we're very busy clinicians. We've had limited capacity, but this does mean that we understand the pressures the healthcare systems are under. One common barrier we heard was how carbon has one brand and roadmap and is easy to address, whereas nature and ocean are inherently complex. And even when we both started with two distinct areas, we found multiple narratives, mechanisms, webs of interconnectivity with different data and missing in different narratives. Our relationships with ocean and nature are deeply complex, and we are clinicians, not ecologists. But actually for healthcare, we found three distinct but interconnecting domains that help to inform our work streams. Those that relate to our nature footprint, for instance, with pollution. Those relate to the opportunity to healthcare to support ecosystem restoration and nature recovery in our estate. And crucially, also those that involve our unique relationship with patients and communities through improved access, addressing inequalities, and advocating for a just transition and equality and connection to nature. And whilst there's a risk of oversimplifying, and of course there's overlap in many areas, it could mean a mechanism to start to think about how we can include nature and ocean and not have them left behind in healthcare's drive to sustainability. It could also mean that pre-existing strategies, such as the overprescribing document from the Ridge Review last year, or the Green Infrastructure Toolkit from Natural England, can be embedded and strengthened. And it can also mean we can look to where there is data or strategy that is missing, so we can ensure that we are not seen as an industry that approaches nature with a view to nature for us, but rather with us and us. Reversing nature loss and approaching the ocean emergency demands action at every level from everyone, and health systems have an opportunity to play a key role. Thank you so much for your time. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Richard Hickson. Please feel free to add questions or comments, and we hope there'll be some time at the end to look at these further.
Thanks, Georgie. That's fantastic as always. I'm just going to hopefully you have some slides up there. Could you just confirm, Elaine, please?
Yes, we can see your slides. Oh, no, they're gone. Now they're back.
Fantastic. Shout out if they disappear again. Okay, thanks very much, Georgie. And thanks, Elaine, for the invite to speak. As Georgie says, I'm a consultant in critical care medicine. I'm co-founder of Healthcare Ocean, and I'm also a member of the UK Ocean Decade Committee, one of the 29 UN Decade Committees. And I'm going to give a fairly quick overview of the trajectory of the oceans with a lean towards human healthcare, but then a section at the end which I'm going to start talking about plastics. It's going to be a pretty quick whistle-stop tour. It is available. The slides will be made available afterwards because there is quite a lot of science and graphs in this, but the science does have to be presented. Scientists are great at creating science. They're not so great all the time at kind of getting it out there. So I'm becoming a voice for some of these clever scientists from the Ocean Decade Committee as well. So everything I have included in this is based in the best science available: IPCC reports, SPOCC, Minderoo Monaco Commission on Human Health and Plastics. If I deviate and talk about grey literature, I will certainly say where. So the ocean is the largest ecosystem, interconnected ecosystem on the planet. 322 million cubic miles of water covering 70% of the Earth's surface and creating 99% of its living space. It absorbs 25% of our anthropogenic CO2, and unfortunately, when it is overwhelmed with too much CO2, and when the photosynthetic capacity is overwhelmed, it acidifies. The CO2 dissolves in the water and it acidifies. And we are currently seeing a very fast rate of acidification. The pH has dropped by 0.13 units over 170 years. That's a 30% rise in hydrogen ion concentration, and we have not seen this level of acidification for millions and millions of years. We tend to talk about carbon dioxide concentrations, Keeling curves. This is 10,000 years ago, just after the last glacial retreat. Lovely stability. We've developed civilization as a result. And because since the Industrial Revolution, the population skyrocketed, 1,368 billion over a very short space of time. And the CO2 has gone up as a result of this and the burning of fossil fuels. Latest reading, 424. That's pretty much what we expect in May this year, a rise of about 2.5-3 parts per million for the year. And it just keeps going up and up. There is no signs of this slowing at the moment. And it's not just CO2 and ocean acidification that is important. Virtually every socioeconomic and Earth system trend has skyrocketed since the 1950s. This black vertical, dotted line is the great acceleration. And you can see why it is termed, or this period of time since it is termed that. Now, ocean acidification is worth a special mention because it's not talked about an awful lot. But is it incredibly serious, and along with warming and anoxia in the oceans, is creating a toxic triad of conditions that is destroying vast ecosystems. For example, this coral reef here. What is more worrying about ocean acidification is now pretty much proven that we are acidifying the oceans faster than the period of time before the end Permian extinction event. This is the third of 5 mass extinction events. It is the greatest. It is known as the Great Dying, and we lost up to 95% of species at this point in time. The reason why acidification is so bad and why the kind of planet falls to bits is simply because a lot of the organisms in the ocean, they have these carbonate shells, these aragonite shells that are very, very thin, as you can see, and they just simply dissolve. And these are pteropods. They are the potato chips of the ocean. They're fed on by loads of species, and they just simply disappear. When you look at some of the reports, like the synthesis report, and I've intentionally kept this page very small so you can't read it, but there's an awful lot of graphs, and you've got to go through an awful lot of graphs and data to really pick out some important points. One of the ones that really struck me is that the policies that we have in place at the moment follow this kind of line here, but our nationally determined contributions in order to hit this blue line here, which is net zero by 2050 and 1.5 degrees C, we are simply way off, absolutely way off. We are not going to meet it. So we are going to overshoot massively. Now, with this present trajectory, we are on course for a 3 degrees temperature rise. I mean, obviously, these are all predictions. If we've got it wrong and it's worse, it could be worse. But we need to be right down here in this pale blue line. And unfortunately, this is related mainly to the greenhouse gas emissions that we are predicting. If we get something unpredictable occurring, like a boreal forest methane burp, then we may very well accelerate this. So when Antonio Manuel Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, has stated within AR6, that we have got this rapidly closing window. Even a 1 degree world, this slide in the background from Korea, is looking pretty grim, and certainly a 2 and 3 degree world will be extremely different to what we are experiencing right now. And we have to make these incredibly deep, profound cuts right now. We have to implement the actions right now, or we are going to be in serious trouble. And I kind of want to know, is there a point where the planet calls time? Is it a point where we can say we hit this and everything's over? Well, it's not that simple, unfortunately. All these kind of graphs and things, they give us predictions, but they don't give us a kind of point where it is just unrecoverable. Some organizations like the GOES Foundation, they do publish, and they have said that, pH 7.95 is a point of no return for carbonate marine life. Now, this is grey literature, but, I'm kind of tempted to still kind of look at this because, it could be right. And if that's the case, then we're looking at 20 to 30 years. If we look at what's happening now, we're already getting these headlines that, the energy in the marine system is off the charts. And as a result, we are getting marine heat waves, which are destroying that ecosystem. And if you combine that with the resultant anoxia, then we have this toxic triad that we see in the build up to these mass extinction events. And it's so important because this toxic triad affects all the species, right down to the very smallest photosynthesizing organisms like Prochlorococcus. They are one of the most abundant organisms in the ocean, and along with diatoms and coccolithophores, are responsible for the oxygen we breathe, the food we eat, and the CO2 absorbed. So these are all pretty major things, I think everyone would agree. But with this toxic triad, we can poison the oceans to the point where actually even net primary production is threatened. Now, net prime reduction is so important for carbon because it all happens up here in the photic zone, the sunlit zone, but at night you get this massive mesopelagic migration of species such as lanternfish, which are the most abundant vertebrate on the planet. Bristlemouths, copepods, squid coming up to feed on this plankton in the surface waters. It is the greatest mass migration on the planet, and it takes place every single night. And all the detritus from this migration, the eating, the defecation, etc., it all falls down into the deep oceans and sediments, sequestering our carbon. But there is evidence that this marine snow is slowing down, that this migration may well be slowing down because of warming oceans that are a result of climate change. But this is the slide, for me, the slide of hope. And this is David Attenborough from A Perfect Planet. By absorbing carbon, phytoplankton are our greatest ally in combating climate change. So how can the smallest organism on the planet, or one of the smallest organisms, on the planet, be so significant? And that is because there is 1 billion tons of phytoplankton generated every 8 days. It turns over really fast. It takes decades for land-based biomass to do what phytoplankton can do in days, and all the time sequestering carbon. Plotting the trajectory of net primary production, however, is extremely difficult, and we've only had the ability over the last couple of decades through NASA's Aqua satellite. And what it gives us some pretty pictures here of chlorophyll concentrations in the oceans, but then it gives a plot over a couple of decades of where it is beginning to change. And these kind of blue and grey areas are where we are starting to see a negative trend. We are seeing a positive trend in the polar regions because it's a favourable environment for plankton to flourish. But when we predict ahead into a high impact scenario, admittedly this is higher than business as usual, but it's still important, obviously it's a gradation, is that if we continue, we will lose masses of biomass. That's the orange here, that's loss of biomass. and loss of fisheries production. And that is where you get, obviously, suddenly this mass migration, starvation, etc., that can occur through the loss of net primary production. So what's at risk? Food security, as I've just mentioned. On the way to that, the loss of livelihoods. Alaska has cancelled its snow crab season because 1 billion crabs have gone missing. We don't know why. It could be warming, acidification, or overfishing, but they've just disappeared. And livelihoods, fishing livelihoods in Alaska are threatened today. Our physical health, we know what COVID did to us, climate change, and certainly oceanic health. If you have massive impacts on human health. 250 million cases of gastroenteritis and respiratory disease are linked annually to swimming in contaminated seas. Harmful algae blooms produce neuro and hepatic toxins. Ingestion of novel substances can lead to antimicrobial resistance. Then we have all the adverse weather effects, drowning, etc. This all impacts upon mental health and well-being, and more unstable oceans from a macro perspective with storm fronts can lead to problems with supply chains. It can impair our ability to discover new medicines. This is Apelidium albicans, which is a fungi that is leading to drugs that are active against viruses and cancer. There are many, many more of these. It's about the impact on carbon sequestration, and it can also impact upon climate regulation by the slowing of the Gulf Stream and other big circulations in the oceans. And there is some evidence that this might be occurring already. And certainly the AR6 says there's medium confidence that it will not collapse. Now, I don't want medium confidence. I want really high confidence that the Gulf Stream isn't going to collapse, because if it does, it has a global impact. So can healthcare drive the change? Well, we've had a lot of documentaries, a lot of films over the last 20 years. And I'd like to think that despite all this promotion that we've had with respects to climate change, that health is different. We had a big presence at COP26, and it led to many more countries signing up to this net zero agenda. And I think it's because we have COVID to draw upon, because COVID almost broke the NHS, and yet we know climate change and deterioration in oceanic health is so much more, and healthcare will not be able to survive. So if we say we can't guarantee we can keep you healthy, I think that on a personal level makes people really sit up and take note. So with respects to what we can do, well, we need to reduce emissions. That's the whole premise behind net zero, but we don't have a lot of space in the atmosphere left for CO2 because of its long half-life. We only have another 500 gigatons before we get to a coin flip scenario for 1.5 degrees. And we emit about 40 gigatons a year. So again, you can see there's not many years left. And the IPCC recognized that we are going to have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We can do that from land-based changes to land-based use, but we have a growing population. We can reforest, but we have to stop deforestation, and we can suck it from the atmosphere, but that is very energy intensive and it has a ceiling. When we look at the Keeling curve, however, this is something else that gives me a cause for hope. Not this climb that is depressing, but this swing as the Earth breathes in and out, as the northern hemisphere gets vegetation growing during spring and summer. And if we kind of think about this bit on the top is the human added CO2 that's pushing it up every year. But look at what nature is doing in the background. The earth, land, and air ecosystems, they are really coping with huge carbon fluxes. And once again, I go back to the oceans especially, because the oceans can bounce back quickly because of this ability for net primary production to increase incredibly rapidly. And we are currently in the UN decade of ocean science. We have established what the oceans are that we want, and now we have to figure out a way of getting there. So how can the NHS improve the state of ocean health? Well, we can do so, as Georgie mentioned, through shipping. Ships produce a gigaton of CO2 every year, but a lot of non-carbon ocean harms as well. And we have great buying power in the NHS to leverage change in our suppliers and leverage change in the shipping industry. This is one of our major work streams and is progressing. Chemical contamination, I'm going to defer that one to Sharon, who will talk about that an awful lot more. Georgie has already touched upon nature and this amazing nature connection, restoration and footprint, which is an amazing way to look at our natural systems. But again, to quote the UN Secretary General, we've got to stop waging war on nature. It is our ally. We cannot survive without it. And plastics. I'm really kind of starting to think very much more about this very toxic substance, because it is, I think, a bigger problem than what we are giving it credit for. Back to 1967, the film's The Graduate, Walter Brooke as Mr. Maguire saying to Dustin Hoffman, I just want to say one word to you, plastics. There's a great future in plastic. It is the signature material of our age, producing all sorts of essential items, including those related to healthcare. But it comes at a great cost to human health, the environment, and the economy. It is responsible for disease, disability, and death at every stage of its life cycle, and this is disproportionately levied on the world's poorest and most vulnerable. Plastics are very simple monomers. This is ethylene. Or ethene, sorry. This is ethene, a very simple alkene that forms these nurdles that we then add loads of toxic things to create plastic products. It supported advances in human civilization such as healthcare, and planes wouldn't exist without plastics. 8.3 billion metric tons since 1950 during the Great Acceleration, 99% from fossil fuels, which are either the feedstocks to create the plastic or the energy used to produce. And they're responsible for about 5% of global CO2 output from the energy required to produce the plastics themselves. We have had, in the time that human population has tripled, in the Great Acceleration, we have had a 230-fold increase in the production of plastics. Single use responsible for 40%. Reduce, reuse, recycle. First two, absolutely bought into it. Recycling, I'm not so sure. The more I look at it, the more I see the cracks in this being sold as a solution because of the nasty additives that get released into the environment or just are perpetuated through the system of recycling. Plastics, they're very confusing. There's 7 different types. I don't know if anyone here has ever kind of looked at these and kind of looked at which are the nasties, which are the better ones. PVC, vinyl chloride's nasty, styrene's nasty, the ethylenes and the propylenes, not quite so nasty. Most of our medical equipment comes from PVC. This is almost impossible to recycle, but essential pieces of kit are made out of PVC, and the additives can leach out into people being treated, if perhaps not so bad in an adult, but if you're a small baby on a neonatal unit, then these additives, which can make up to 40% of the plastics themselves, like phthalates, leach out into the patients being treated. And it's not just medical equipment. This is a stack of coffee cup lids in my own trust. I had a quick look at these. I thought they were probably a polypropylene. They're not. They're a polystyrene, and that's virtually impossible actually to recycle. And again, recycling actually produces an awful lot of microplastics, and when we send it abroad, there's all sorts of socio-economic justice issues with this route. When we look at what happens to plastics in the environment, they're ubiquitous from cities to the tallest mountains to the depths of the Mariana Trench. Plastics are found absolutely everywhere, and in human systems, macroplastics can clog rivers, leading to floodings. There is a decrease in the number of shark attacks at the moment, 5 recorded that were fatal in 2022. 100 million sharks are killed every year by humans. So that's 20 million humans per shark. So I think, we shouldn't be afraid to go in the water. I think perhaps the sharks should be more afraid to go in the water than us. When we look at other species like seabirds, this is an albatross chick that had died from plastic ingestion, and even the smaller particles can actually scar the gullets of birds, leading to immune suppression. When we start talking about microplastics in the open ocean, how can microplastics possibly poison all these millions of cubic miles of ocean? But microplastics are everywhere. They're breakup products of macroplastics. They're in cosmetics, in clothing, in paint, and they all find their way to the oceans, where they act as vectors for all sorts of other hydrophobic chemicals and microbes. And we are now finding microplastics absolutely everywhere within the ocean. The hazardous chemicals are as important within plastics as the plastics themselves. They're not really bound to the plastics very well, so they leach out. And a number of these can be endocrine disruptors like BPAs, dioxins, PFAS, other phthalates. They leach out and they are unsafe in low dose. I mean, over 10% of the additives are high concern, and some of these just haven't been studied. If we look at the health impacts, I mean, I'm not going to dwell on this side. It's all pretty awful. We ingest them, we inhale them, we have indirect impacts from plastics, and they cause an awful lot of proven health problems. But there's a great future in plastics. In 2022, last year, November, the 6 billion ethane cracker in Monaco, Pennsylvania, opened to crack ethane into ethene to create polyethylenes. As you can see here, this is our chief ecologist, Donald Trump, overseeing the construction in the Rust Belt to rejuvenate the Rust Belt of America. Within a couple of months, it exceeded its annual targets for unauthorized emissions through flare-offs. If you look at where it's situated, here it is, a couple of 100 meters from a shopping mall, housing area. There's a family dentistry there. These aren't, you don't find these at Mar-a-Lago or whatever Donald Trump's golf club's called. You find these in poor areas. And this is where I start to get really uncomfortable with plastics, because by the time our medical products have got to us, they have probably done harm collectively to people, places, and communities that we've never even thought of. And you don't have to live by an ethane cracker to be harmed by these. And certainly within quite a distance of many of these facilities, there is harm to be. The harm occurs through contamination of drinking water, etc. And Cancer Alley was a term that was actually coined in 1987 when I went to medical school. The economic costs of plastics through human health harm are enormous. They are externalized by the fossil fuel industry, and the public purse usually picks up the tab. However, good news, last two slides, the UNEP Plastic Treaty has been agreed. This aims to reduce to end plastic pollution, and certainly the work that we've been doing with the Mindry Monaco Commission supports this. A global cap on production, a simplification of plastics, reduction in additives, eliminate unnecessary use, and extended producer responsibility with respect to the economics. And the actions you can all take with respect to plastics, or we can all take, is educate each other. We are a great voice when we stick together. Reduce our consumption. We can do this in healthcare through various things. We can use fewer single-use items, stop the open just-in-case culture, challenge our suppliers, and use procurement and economic drivers to drive change. This will be cost-effective. That has been proven in reduction in air pollution and reduction in demands on healthcare systems from improving people's health. It will require policy change and communication, but we need to buy ourselves time until safer alternatives are available. Now, I'm going to stop there and stop sharing. I've just gone over a couple of minutes. My apologies for that. And I'm now going to move on, or we are now going to move on to Sharon Fledger, who hopefully is now there. Fantastic.
I am, Richard. Thank you so much to both you and Georgie for incredible presentations to set the scene for us today. Elaine, my slide should be up. Is it up now?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And just like Richard said, if it does anything stops, just give me a shout. So I'm really delighted to be here today to follow on from what Georgie and Richard were talking about. I'm going to talk about eco-directed sustainable prescribing now, and how pharmaceuticals are actually polluting our world as well. So I work in NHS Highland up in Inverness as a consultant in pharmaceutical public health, and I also am the co-founder and the NHS lead for the One Health Breakthrough Partnership that I'll tell you a little bit more about in a while. So why am I talking about medicines? Well, Richard said there's an awful lot of plastic used in healthcare. Well, there's an awful lot of medicines used as well. Medicines have changed the face of healthcare over the last century, and they have made our population better in many ways. The prescription of a medicine is the most common thing that we do now in the NHS, whether it's to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. And lots of money goes into it as well, about £20 billion a year across the UK. But we know that the use of medicines is increasing. Over the last 15 years, our medicines have increased in Scotland by over 40%. And that's because we have more people to treat. The world has just reached 8 billion recently. We have more older people who take more medicines, and we have technological advances. We can now cure diseases like hepatitis C and HIV that we never could before. But also, sadly, in our culture, we have a pill for every ill society. And from that, there is an awful lot of waste as well. So we hear from many people that the damage to our planet is totally down to us as humans. We live in a consumerist society. And I would suggest to you that medicine is also a consumerist society, the taking of medicines. People turn to medicine for every complaint they've got these days, instead of actually thinking about what they could do themselves. So we are consuming lots of medicines. So I want to take you back, and probably a lot of clinicians around the table today, want to take you back to university days, and also with a patient in front of you. What you think about is, does the drug work? Is it the right drug for the patient? How long will it take to clear their body? Will it affect their kidneys, their liver, etc.? But maybe not so often, if at all, you think or you have been taught about ecotoxicology or pharmacoenvironmentology. And that essentially, ecotoxicology is the effect of a medicine, a pharmaceutical, whenever it gets into our environment. So what does it do? And we've got to remember that medicines are actually made to have a biological effect at very, very small doses, and they will have that biological effect wherever the right receptor is, or the right body for them, whether that's a human body, an animal body, or aquatic life. Now, so far, Georgie and Richard have been talking about oceans. A lot of the work that I've been involved in is focused on rivers, but let's remember that our rivers end up in our oceans. So what's the problem with pharmaceuticals? Well, every time we take an oral dose of a medicine, between about 30 and 100% of that dose ends up in our pee and our poo, going down the toilet into our municipal wastewater treatment plants. Those treatment plants were never designed to remove small, complex chemical molecules. They were designed to remove larger biological solids, and I'll leave it there. So about 90% of the pollution that we find in our rivers in the environment from pharmaceuticals comes from people taking medicines. About 5% comes from people dumping them down the toilet because they think it's the safest place to put a medicine that they don't need, is to flush it away so that maybe their children can't get it under their kitchen bin and poison themselves. And about 5%, the other 5% comes from pharmaceutical manufacturing processes. So let's have a little look at the evidence for what pharmaceuticals are doing to our environment. This slide shows the latest worldwide study from Wilkinson and Boxall et al. In York, where they studied every single continent in the world. They analysed for 61 different medicines. And yep, they found medicines all over the world, in every continent. But the thing that gets me is that in over 25% of those rivers, there was a threat to the environmental and or human health from the concentrations of medicines found there. And they're finding most commonly analgesics, antibiotics, and anticonvulsants. Nothing that hasn't been found in other studies. It's very similar. But if we move to look at the UK, this is a very small town right in the top of my patch in the north of Scotland. And this slide actually shows pharmaceuticals that have been found in the wastewater effluent. Now, what's so bad about that is that effluent is the water that has already been treated in wastewater treatment processes. So these pharmaceuticals are ending up being pumped into our environment. Very commonly used medicines there, heart medicines, antidepressants, antimicrobials. So it is a global picture. It's happening everywhere. Now let's look at some of the evidence for specific medicines. If we look at diclofenac first, it's one of the most ecotoxic medicines that we have. On the rainbow trout here, it has affected their liver, their kidneys, and their gills, ultimately leading to fish death. Moving on to another non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, ibuprofen. Again, a series of fish here, 4 different fish, and it's changed reproduction, iron regulation, cardiac abnormalities, and the enzyme pathways. Moving on to paracetamol. Paracetamol is one of the most prescribed drugs in the world. It's acutely toxic to nearly every species in aquatic environmental testing. It changes behavior, it's neurotoxic, the list just goes on and on. I know we're talking about water today, but I'm going to introduce you in a moment to the One Health Breakthrough Partnership, and I want to give you an example of One Health here, where the health of humans, animals, and the environment is being affected. In India, cows were treated with diclofenac. When they die, the culture and farming practice out there is to leave the cows dead in the field. So the vultures come down and feed on the meat of the cows, and diclofenac causes catastrophic kidney failure in vultures. So we now are seeing up to a 99% decrease in the population in India of species of vulture. And because the vultures aren't there, the rabid dogs from society then come and eat on the meat. So there has been an increase in cases of rabies as well, leading to ill human health. So we've always got to think about the whole picture of our environment. And of course, I haven't mentioned so far that a byproduct of the wastewater treatment processes is the production of sludge. And this sludge is then put on our fields as fertilizer, so that any pharmaceuticals that are in the sludge then get into our human food chain. And there's been evidence of vegetables like lettuce, soya, potatoes, all having pharmaceutical contamination. I've shown you just a few examples. I could talk all about the evidence for different pharmaceuticals, and yeah, we use about 2,000 in the UK. But to date, the major concerns have been changes with growth, reproduction, physiology, and behaviour in aquatic life. But the biggest concern is the increase in antimicrobial resistance. Now, we know that antimicrobial resistance is a really big public health concern. It's often referred to as a silent pandemic. I refer to it as Pandemic Plus, because the pandemic killed about 3 million people a year over the 2-year period. AMR is set to kill 10 million people across the globe every single year by 2050. And antibiotics are a really important part of healthcare. They're across every single part that we operate in. But if we don't have any antibiotics, let's just think about what could happen. Maybe we can't do routine operations. Maybe we can't give cancer patients chemotherapy, because these procedures could become life-threatening without prophylactic antibiotics. And there are very few antibiotics coming on the new drugs pipeline. So we really do have to preserve the antibiotics that we do have. But from all this evidence that we've gathered, and the evidence has been around since the 1950s, lots of evidence out there, what we don't yet know is, will daily exposure by human beings to these subtherapeutic doses over a length of time have negative human health impacts? We're starting to see research on that. Children, pregnant women, vulnerable populations, they're having an impact. Richard talked about lots of things going into the ocean. There is that chemical cocktail. There are microplastics, there are disinfectants, there are PFAS, phthalates, pharmaceuticals. How will all these chemicals actually interact? What do the metabolites do if it's not the parent drug that's coming into the river? And we just don't have data on just how toxic, persistent, or bioaccumulative all these medicines actually are in our environment. So about 6 years ago in Scotland, we decided to found the One Health Breakthrough Partnership. You can see the steering group organisations there. SEPA, our Scottish Environment Protection Agency. John's in our audience today. Scottish Water, we have one water company in Scotland. NHS Highland, the Environmental Research Institute of the University of the Highlands and Islands, and CREW, our Centre for Water Expertise and Research. Our vision is to have a non-toxic environment. We have a beautiful Highlands and Islands. It's important for food and drink production, for tourism, and for a healthy population, and we want to keep it that way. So that's our vision, to have a non-toxic environment. We want to reduce the environmental impact of our healthcare services, and we've started by looking at pharmaceuticals in the environment and some AMR as well. And we're working at that One Health interface, thinking about humans, animals, and the environment. We have a website, which I will put in the references at the end, and it was also in the QR code there. But we have lots of work, whether it's patient videos, published papers, webinars, education series. Please do take a look if this is of interest to you. I haven't got time to go over all the work that we've done in the One Health Breakthrough Partnership today, but I want to move now to solution. So we've talked a lot about the problems today, and both Georgie and Richard have given us some great solutions that healthcare can do. So now let's think about the solutions for pharmaceuticals. Over the last 5 years, the work of the One Health Breakthrough Partnership has culminated in this research project from the Medical Research Council. It's a UK first. We want to look to develop a formulary framework that actually incorporates environmental data alongside clinical and cost effectiveness data. While I've presented probably to between 5,000 and 6,000 clinicians over the last 5 years, the question I always get asked at the end is, Sharon, how can I prescribe in a greener fashion? And so far, we just don't have the tools or the data available. There's been some work done in Sweden in the WISE list, but they're using it for only 9 medicines. So what we want to do is actually, if a prescriber has 2 drugs, they both do the same for the patient, they both cost about the same to the NHS, we want to be able to tell them which drug is better for the environment so that they can prescribe the one that's better for the patient and better for the planet. And that's what this project's about. It's a proof of concept. We won't get all the answers at the end of the day, but we hope it'll be the start of a tranche of research so that prescribers can get the information that they need. So now I'd like to move on to, before we get all of those data, how can you actually reduce your pharmaceutical footprint impact in healthcare? I'm going to present some stats now that are probably quite shocking to me, really, and it shows that we need to do better in the care that we provide. And simply by doing better, we can reduce our plastic footprint, we can reduce our carbon footprint, and we can reduce the pharmaceutical pollution footprint as well. Now, if you remember from one of my very first slides, I said that we use £20 billion of taxpayers' money on medicines every year. But about 50% of those medicines don't actually get taken at all or as intended. So if they're not getting taken, we don't have the clinical outcomes. We have more morbidity, more mortality. We have people coming back to their GP, coming back into hospital. So we have more interventions and we have more waste, and we have a huge carbon footprint as a result as well. We know that the most environmentally friendly medicine we can take is the one that's not needed, not prescribed. But yet these medicines have been needed, they've been prescribed, they've been shipped across the world on our oceans. Most of our drugs, 95% of the raw ingredient comes from China or India. So a lot of pollution for drugs that aren't actually being taken. So we need to do better with adherence to medicines. This slide shows the medicines from just one deceased patient. You can see months and months of repeat prescriptions there, just lying unopened. So a huge amount of waste, huge amount of carbon, plastic, and money that could be spent with other things. This latest OECD report on tackling wasteful clinical care has shown that 20% of the care that we offer currently has no clinical value for the patient. We know that 1 in 10 of our patients is unnecessarily harmed at the point of care, and money is tight in healthcare. especially after COVID, but yet 10% of our hospital budgets are being spent to correct preventable mistakes and preventable infections. And remember that AMR story as well. We are trying to use antibiotics as little as possible, but if we've got more infections, we're using more. We also know that there's overdiagnosis and testing and overtreatment for a range of reasons. So we do have to get better at that. And these are all things that we can do right now before we get those extra data. We have Dr. Vicky Brund here, who's a geriatrician in the US. She obviously treating older patients with polypharmacy, but her mantra is that if a bad thing is happening to a patient, a drug did it until proven otherwise. So I'm showing on the screen there lots of resources that there are to consider polypharmacy, inappropriate polypharmacy. Sometimes polypharmacy is required, but there is a lot of inappropriate polypharmacy out there. And I'd particularly like to draw to your attention this project that has just finished across Scotland, Northern Ireland and Ireland, looking at a 7 steps framework to appropriate polypharmacy. It's got a fantastic website, lots of resources for patients and professionals, tells you all about numbers needed to treat, numbers needed to harm, really drives home the question about whether a pharmaceutical is the right intervention to make for somebody. One of the most helpful things that you can do in your practice all the time, not just for medicines, but for anything you want to do with or to a patient, is the BRAN acronym. Benefits, risks, alternatives. What if we do nothing? And actually to discuss that with the patient, because too often we don't discuss those benefits and risks. And maybe if we did, we would find that the patient wouldn't want the intervention. But I guess the thing that I would really say to you is really to think in every stage of your practice. So think before prescribing. That was the BRAN. And what matters to me? Ask the patient. What matters to the patient? It isn't necessarily leaving the surgery, leaving the consultation with a prescription for a medicine. We may think it is, but it's not. I've got a lovely quote here from Dan Dugfirth from the BMA, because we know that it's much easier to prescribe something than it is to stop prescribing it. So starting medications is like the bliss of marriage, and stopping them is like the agony of divorce. So that's a good one to remember. And whilst you're prescribing, can you actually defer the prescription of a medicine? For instance, if your patient has mild to moderate depression, can you put them on online CBT? Because we know that the antidepressants take 6 to 8 weeks to start working, and by that time they could have finished their course of CBT and not needed the antidepressant, with some quite horrid side effects too. And if you do have to start prescribing, are you prescribing the minimum dose and the minimum amount? Again, 10 to 15% of our hospital A&E admissions are because of adverse events from a medicine. So if a patient starts a medicine, has that adverse event in the first week or fortnight, and we've prescribed them 2 months of medicine, there's 7 or 8 weeks of wasted medicine again. And after prescribing, too often people just go into the abyss with their medicines, but we need to think about reviewing them, about asking how they're getting on. I was in a meeting the other day and with a patient representative, and he said, "Oh, I've been on my antidepressants for 20 years. I don't think they're working." Why is he still on them? So let's think at every stage. So I hope today that I've shown you that that One Health triad of healthy people, healthy environment, and healthy animals is so important for the health of us as human beings, and to preserve our rivers, our oceans, and our biodiversity. We know that climate change is a health crisis. We know it's responsible for many deaths, but health absolutely can change this climate crisis. At no other time in history has the health service been in the beautiful position of being able to take the opportunity to change climate change and actually improve the health of our population right now, but for generations to come as well. So on this World Ocean Day, if you feel like any extra CPD, I've put lots of resources there that you'll be able to get on the website after the presentation's finished. But for now, thank you so much. You can contact me, happy to take queries at any time on my email, also on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thanks to Sharon, Richard, and Georgie, all our speakers. They're fantastic. There's so much in there. And for everybody joining, we will share the slides on our website afterwards. We've got some questions come through the chat, and if anyone wants to put their hand up as well, or I might call on you to ask your own questions, because I see there's been quite a good discussion in there. I might kick off if that's okay. I've got a question. I think, Sharon, it was you that said we always need to think about the whole picture of the environment. But currently, like globally, we're dealing with the climate crisis and the nature crisis as if they're separate challenges. So we have the climate COP, we have the biodiversity COP, and the research communities that pull together the evidence for both of the COPs are separate research communities. There seems to be very little interaction between the two. So the question is, in order to realistically do what we need to do we need to pull all of this together and treat it as a whole? Or is there a place for handling these things independent of each other? Because that's what we're doing just now. So I put that question to the panel. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in first, Elaine. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the reason they're dealt with in their silos, and we do enough of that in healthcare, don't we? We treat things in silos, and that's what leads us to a lot of the problems in healthcare. They do need different experts. We can't all be experts on everything, so they absolutely do need experts in the field. But I think so far for me, the issue is that people refer to climate change. And I think if we start referring to the triple planetary crisis, we then have that umbrella of climate change, net zero carbon emissions, biodiversity loss and pollution, all the things that we've covered today. I'm sure Richard and Georgie can absolutely jump in here as well, particularly Richard with your Monaco work there on plastics as well. So I'll leave that now.
Yeah, agreed, Sharon. I mean, obviously, even within Healthcare Ocean, we have divvied up the work because, every single part of this takes an awful lot to get to grips with, especially as a clinician most of the time. So, whereas Georgie is very much more focused on the nature side, I'm very much more ships and plastic. But I do agree. I mean, I think we have to have this holistic view. And I like the climate, the nature, and the pollution headlines. I do like them. And I also think it's a good way to look at proposed solutions, because we have this tendency as this, if you buy an electric vehicle and you say, I'm driving a zero emission vehicle, well, what you are driving is a zero tailpipe emission vehicle. You still have brake and tire dust. And they are one of the biggest contributors to oceanic microplastics on the planet. So again, I think it's very important to approach all these things holistically, but then be very realistic about how you then get into the detail, because you can find yourself rapidly overwhelmed.
Yeah, I think for me, my feeling would be that addressing all of it together is really, really important, because otherwise ocean nature, they're going to get left behind, and pollution, in fact, outside of carbon. The climate emergency declarations and the net zero roadmaps are absolutely fantastic, but they now needed to be joined in, not separated, with a different mechanism. I think there's a really interesting approach to understanding nature from us all. We've got a very personal view of it, but actually making sure those three domains, and that's perhaps why I wrote those that way, of looking at our footprint to nature and biodiversity as well as carbon, making sure we always consider nature recovery as well, and making sure that we think about the people side of it, because we are a healthcare industry and we deal with people and health, means that if you add that in, that then you don't leave anything behind. We need to be in line with other industries. Looking at what's moving forward, the concept of net zero and nature positive is a bit reductionist, and it's debatable. But within Nature Positive, we have those 3 domains, and we have those 23 targets. We strengthen, not take away from carbon net zero by becoming part of the same movement rather than being separate. Because we can use these existing strategies that look at overprescribing and so on, or building back nature, rather than having it all separate. The more we can include things, in my perspective, the better.
Thank you. And they're just so interconnected, aren't they? One impacts on the other so much. I goes to some. Oh, John, I was actually just going to go to you anyway, because you've asked quite a few questions and I couldn't choose. Thank you for putting your hand up. You may take the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I've been very inspired by these 3 presentations. Just a little bit of background without indulging myself too much. I was born in Kuwait. My father worked in the oil business for 40 years. I was very inspired by Jacques Cousteau and the undersea exploration from a very early age. And my passion was very much to go and study marine biology. Anyway, the long and short of it, I worked for the Clyde River Purification Board Marine Survey Team 38 years ago. And over the years, it's interesting how the science, the multidisciplinary science that we did then, has moved across to other aspects of the environment, and also the connection with health. Very much people, planet and prosperity are all interlinked, aren't they? And so much of the work that we do in SEPA, I work for the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, ultimately aims to protect people from the adverse effects of environmental exposure, and increasingly to realise the benefits of the environment for health and well-being. And the third pillar, if you like, is that of sustainable healthcare. And I'm very much involved with Sharon in the One Health Breakthrough Partnership. As we think of the triple planetary crisis, I put a link in the chat to the recent presentation given by Hans Broijink, if that's how you pronounce it, the Belgian, who was formerly the head of the European Environment Agency. I think that illustrates very nicely, and I won't articulate the detail just now, the issues and the need for more integration and the way to address the shortfalls that have arisen in this space. So I would encourage people to look at that. I wondered, I was just in the process of writing a message in the chat, and given that the talks have been recorded, and given just how valuable I think the talks are, I wondered if, Georgie, given the slight technical glitch at the beginning, it might be possible to re-record your talk so that there isn't that any, so it doesn't detract, that technical glitch doesn't detract from the message. I was also thinking, and I'll try and pick up on all my questions if I can very succinctly, clearly getting this message out there across society is so fundamental, isn't it? Education and behavior change is instrumental in driving the world, the way the world operates. And I wanted to some extent, and to what extent this message is included in primary, secondary and tertiary education. And indeed, when it comes to healthcare practitioners, is this mainstream now in the training of new doctors? It strikes me that it very much needs to be. As we think about more holistic medicine and more precision and realistic medicine, this very much makes sense, doesn't it? In terms of health economics, in terms of delivering improvements for people and the planet. It's all interlinked. And it would be good to see a new generation of professionals coming through in healthcare who are very much, if you like, weaned on that whole message. I think also just one final message, and it's great to hear from Sharon and the others. And whilst there's focus on human pharmaceuticals, I'm also keen to see more attention being given in a similar way to veterinary pharmaceuticals. I know some progress has been made, but I think a lot more needs to be done in the context of One Health. I'm also conscious that when we think about One Health, we shouldn't overlook plant health. We do have a big problem with fungal infections of crops. We do use azole fungicides, and there's an increasing body of evidence to show the link between environmental exposure and resistance in the clinic to antifungal agents. So that's probably enough from me for now, but thank you for hearing that out. I'm very supportive of this, and it's great that we're having this event on World Ocean Day, and I'm keen to certainly share these messages with my colleagues here in SEPA, and I'll make an effort to do that and communicate elsewhere. And I guess you've already got great social media coverage, and I raised the issue about Radio 4 or whatever it might be, other mechanisms for getting the messages out there, because fantastic talks today, really fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, John. There's quite a lot in your questions as well. So the two main kind of points I think would be good if the panel want to pick up on. So one is around the pharmaceuticals, and does anybody know if we're talking about the human pharmaceuticals of the veterinary side? I mean, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons are members of the UK Health Alliance. I don't know if anybody from there is here today and be able to speak to that. And secondly, that piece about education. Do any of you know if there is, how much is being done? From the work we've been doing with the UK Health Alliance, I think the question you asked, John, was if it's mainstream, and my understanding that it's not mainstream just now, but there is a lot of work being done to try and get more education for sustainable healthcare embedded into curriculum across the board with medical. I put in the chat, the allied health professionals are currently looking at their curriculum as well. But over to the panel, will be more expert than me. Georgie, I see you've taken your mic off. Do you want to go first?
I think we're speaking from the region that has the first faculty of sustainable healthcare in the northeast, Fahini. So I've got a bit of understanding potentially, but largely there's a bit of narrative disparity for healthcare sustainable education. Quite often we talk in terms of planetary health, and sometimes it's looked at as sustainable healthcare. Most often the mapping that I did, looking at different curriculums, shows a very strong voice for the climate emergency and for air pollution, which is absolutely fantastic and of course crucial, but maybe some slightly different approaches to nature and biodiversity, and not very much about, or not so much about, ocean and water systems. And again, sometimes it's patchy. You might get something to talk about that connection where we might do the climate emergency, air pollution, and talk about maybe nature prescribing, so how we can use nature, but perhaps not how we can support nature to recover or reduce our footprint. So it's really variable. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to try and find out the places where we can try to get in and support maybe sharing some of this information in the way that Sharon and Richard have just described around our footprint, but then also that interconnectivity and the recovery aspect of it, and that really important bit about involving communities and patients as well. So it's really variable. It's different around the country. The Planetary Health Report Card looks at undergraduate curriculums and is a real encouraging push to try and improve it. But again, how then biodiversity and nature are shared in that, I don't know. And as John's pointed out, what we haven't done is look at mapping veterinary education, which obviously is something very important with all of this. The more joined up the vision and the more we have a structure and a strategy, the better.
Sharon, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, sure, I can, Elaine. So answering the first one, vet. Pharmaceutical pollution really hasn't been mentioned in healthcare at all before, I think, the development of the One Health Breakthrough Partnership. And in that 5 or 6 years, people have become interested and alarmed and wanting to take action. So sorry, it's not about the vet, it's about the education bit. So great things that Georgie has talked about there, but in university curricula, it does take time. There's a lot of process behind that to get it integrated. They go through maybe 4 or 5 year cycles to get reaccredited for the content on their curriculum. But there's lots of work going on. It's not mainstreamed, but lots of pockets of great work, and people are aware of the issue now. So there's lots of resources out there that people can access. And we look forward to the work on the Planetary Health Card for universities across the world, leading to that integration across all university courses. It's not just in medicine it's required in all health professions. About the vet meds, yeah, John and I often have conversations about vet meds. We know that human meds, vet meds, probably 50-50 or even 40-60 to vet meds in the environment. I've been working with vets for about the last 2 or 3 years to educate their clients for their pets. Also working with one of the largest veterinary companies in the world. They've now got a head of pharmaceutical sustainability, so it shows you how much they're thinking about this. Just this week, the Veterinary Medicines Directorate of the UK government has launched a Pharmaceuticals in the Environment group and is looking for more partners on that. So as I said, it takes time for policy to change, policy makers to change, and we are seeing the changes coming through now. Last year, we were successful in changing Scottish policy for our climate change and sustainability strategy, something that I would never have thought could have happened within 5 years of the work that we've done. I would have been thinking probably 10 or 20 years in policy terms. So yeah, I think vet meds are coming to the fore, and we will see a change, a big change in the next few years.
Thanks, that's really encouraging. Sorry, Richard,
Yeah, I was just going to put a couple of links in the chat just to organisations I'm aware of who are providing some education to schools, one of which is national, one of which is to the northeast. From the point, I'm so glad you've answered the one about universities and veterinary medicines, Sharon and Georgie, thank you for that. The other thing is postgrad education as well, because the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare and FOSH have put together a building a net zero module for healthcare professionals, and that's 1.4 million people who can be educated, who are just sat there. So we have mandatory training, and yet there has been this reluctance to get sustainability topics as a mandatory training module. So we are having to come up with all sorts of ingenious ways to get people to do these sustainability modules. And we have had some success with that, which is great. I mean, my own trust, I think we're 90% or something, around 93% of people have undertaken this module. I mean, that's unheard of in a e-learning for health module undertaken in a secondary care establishment. But it shows the appetite that people have for wanting to learn about climate change and sustainability. The other thing that we've been doing is trying to think, how do we take actions that we do and turn them into stories? So for example, with our shipping actions, we try and create a story. So we try then to turn it into something that can be published somewhere as a isn't it interesting how we've made these links, and we can drive change in this way through other industries. And certainly work that we're doing Philips Healthcare, my own critical care unit, we're publishing this as a case study and a story, because people like stories and they like positive stories, and we can educate in a number of innovative ways outside of curricula too.
Thank you. Timothy Malone, you see you've got your hand up and you've put a few questions too, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Brilliant talks by everybody, by the way. Thank you. So many topics. It's almost overwhelming. One I was going to address to Sharon first, and something which I wasn't really aware of until fairly recently, is that we're often encouraged within the NHS to prescribe generically because it's cheaper, but of course actually generic drugs seem to actually have a much bigger carbon footprint, probably because they're made further away and the manufacturing is not so scrutinized, and they have greater environmental harm, and that doesn't seem to be people don't seem to be very aware of that across the NHS. And I was just wondering whether you have any comments on that, or Georgie has any comments from a primary care. Richard will be in a controlled environment, so he won't have any choice about what the drugs are.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Timothy, actually. And the reason that there are more generic drugs is because they make up probably 90 to 95% of our prescribing. And you're right, generic APIs, the raw ingredients are mainly made in India and China, India for our antimicrobials. So we do have to ship them across the ocean. Also, the environmental risk assessments that are part of the licensing process for the European Medicines Agency only came into being in 2006. So most of the drugs that we use, that chart that I put up that showed you the drugs coming out in my effluent, every single drug was a generic that was made before, even when I practiced a few decades ago with patients, I was using those drugs. So no environmental risk assessments for those. So the information isn't out there. And I think we do have to start making people aware of the difference in the new drugs and the older drugs. The new drugs will have environmental risk assessments. Of course, that isn't taken into account at the moment on whether they get a license. So even if they're really ecotoxic, they still get a license and we still prescribe them. The latest publication from the EU has now made ERAs to bring them into the licensing process, but also to include them in the decision-making process. So we'll see what change that has across Europe and whether the MHRA, which is now in charge of that in the UK, will follow suit. But no, great point. Thank you.
Just to come back, I mean, did you think the environmental bit, there needs to be a section in the PIL, in the patient information leaflet, for everybody? I mean, we're getting on more products now. Maybe it's a promotional thing, but it would be great if that was sort of, you know, a whole life assessment or something about the environmental impact of that drug.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been talking with the pharmaceutical industry about that. And just a fortnight ago, I talked to the head of sustainability in one of the companies, talking about both the PIL, because often people just chuck it in the bin. It's got such small writing on it, but also the packaging as well. And one of the challenges is apparently the legislation in every single country that they send the drugs to is different. So it needs, and also apparently the PIL people just put their hands up when you say you want to add something else to the PIL because there's so much in it already. But no, absolutely, we're calling for information to be more accessible, more transparent, because it's really difficult to get hold of the environmental risk assessments as well. So yeah, all for that.
Yeah, and I think just picking up from that as well, as a clinician, I think Jennifer wrote in one of the comments as well, something about, as the GP, the issue is with click fatigue. There are so many notifications when we're prescribing and we are so short of time, and often we're looking at looking after people with the polypharmacy and the multimorbidity and trying to make sense of hospital requests, and we have a very short amount of time. And again, just to go back to that notion of that sustainable clinical care being the highest quality clinical care, the more person-centered, looking at what matters most to our patients and listening that we're able to do, the lower the prescribing rates, and just that real sort of push as well for prevention becoming so much more important in how we look at healthcare systems and what we can do to support communities to thrive, so that we can reduce some of these massive discrepancies in medicalizations between communities as well.
Just are you getting, out of interest, I'm not a GP, but are you getting you know, come back feedback from your patient participation groups that they want you know, the greener healthcare and more information about the ecological and environmental effect of healthcare is rising up in the public consciousness, or have they not been asked yet?
Yes,
There's been some amazing.
Sorry,
no, Sharon.
No, you go ahead.
No. Okay, well, I was just from the perspective of GPs, there's been amazing work done through Greener Practice looking at particular carbon hotspot medications around inhalers, and absolutely people have been asked, and the majority of people, once they found out that there was a better alternative and that the highest quality care would be the lowest quality, the lowest impact on the environment, there's been lots of patient engagement in those terms. And sometimes just from a one-to-one basis, I don't bring it up in the consultation room, but often people come in and say, why was I given 3 months of statins? I didn't even try them first. I am very concerned about this waste. What can I've had a consultation where someone's come in to say that. And again, that's a one-off situation, but absolutely it's something that we perhaps need to be aware of as well. Sorry, Sharon.
No, please don't apologise. I hadn't realised Timothy was coming back to your question, Georgie. Right, what were we talking about? I've forgotten. Could you remind me?
Was it patient participate?
Exactly that. Yes, it was. So yeah, as part of the project that I talked about, we've had a patient and public focus group, and they actually surprisingly were quite well aware of pharmaceutical pollution, but also wanted to know more. They absolutely wanted the information on the packaging so that they could vote with their feet. Interestingly, with what Georgie said, when we offered them the choice of having a pharmaceutical that may be a little bit less effective, but much better for the planet, they said, no way. So I know it's only a small focus group, it's small numbers of people, and we might not get different results with others. But that was a bit of an eye-opener for me. So we need to really think about how to get the message across and how to provide greener healthcare for people.
Thanks.
you.
Riza, do you want to come in there? Oh, we can't hear you. Actually, you're muted. Riza Zamani, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Can you not unmute?
Sorry, I was
Sorry.
looking for the.
Oh, there you
for the
go.
icon. First, I'm using the Meet. A couple of questions for the chat panel. One is, what's the total cost, economic cost of clearing the mess that pharmaceutical companies have caused the earth? And the second question is, has anyone kept them to account for actually paying for these costs? And how do we go about doing it? I mean, is it feasible? To what extent is it feasible to clear the mess? The other question was really, I have constantly having problem returning my medicine to my local pharmacist and my GP that I've not used, I haven't used, they are expired and all that. And they look at me as if I've just landed from Mars. They don't want to know about these things. What do we do about that?
I'm happy to pick up the bit about extended producer responsibility, because I think this is absolutely key, Riza. This is something that is coming up repeatedly, and I'll draw comparisons with the plastic industry. The plastic industry in 2021 was worth 600 billion in the production of plastics alone. And yet all the costs of harm are completely externalized. So plastics is not cheap. It is not cheap from the perspective of human healthcare, from planetary health, any aspect apart from the profitability within the plastics industry for producing cheap polymers. Everything else is picked up by somebody else, and this has got to change. So the economic models are yet not looking are not mature enough, or they're too traditional. I'm not an economist, but the economics doesn't work to drive change, and it has to. And the fact that the UNEP committee and the plastics treaty has highlighted this specifically as something that must change, I am hoping, at least for plastics, that it is something that can be driven. And I do believe, and again, Sharon will know far more about this than I do, that we should have a similar extended producer responsibility within the pharmaceutical industry. And it's in their interest, because if the planet and people die, they haven't got a business left. So they might as well look at trying to pick up some of the tab anyway, because then it extends the life of their own businesses.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, sticky mic. Yeah, EPR, that's a difficult one, because from the pharmaceutical industry, they'll say, well, you're the users of the drugs, it's your responsibility. But at the end of the day, I think it's everyone's responsibility. So we have to try to use fewer pharmaceuticals, use them in a better manner, and we have to work with industry around that life cycle of the drugs, actually making new drugs that are benign by design, that once they work inside the body that they're meant to be working in, that they're then benign when they get out. That's very difficult. It'll take probably a couple of decades to get there. Yeah, it's a very complex picture, extended producer responsibility. But I absolutely echo what Richard said, that the money's in the companies, the harm is external, and if they don't have a planet or don't have humans, they won't have a business. So we need to come to some solution.
And I think from my perspective, I can't talk to the financial compensation as part of what some of the recommendations from COP would look like as far as some of that pharmaceutical pollution. But looking at those two tools that I put there on that slide for industry moving forward, the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures, for instance, it's fascinating. I recommend looking through both of those and the corporations that have already signed up, and looking at perhaps how that could be for some of our suppliers and the drug companies that we work with, in how they would need to be reporting and disclosing pollution moving forward into the future. I think things are changing in this area, and I think it's really interesting to have a look at some of the ways that might take place.
Thank you. So unfortunately our time is up. I think we've got so many more questions we could have got in the chat, but I will need to finish it there. So thank you so much to our three speakers, and also to everyone who's joined us and has asked questions and shared links and everything in the chat. It's been such an informative and really interesting talk today. So just thanks so much to everyone. I will close it there, and we will, like I say, get this recording as quickly as we can onto our website and the presentation slides as well. So enjoy the rest of World Ocean Day. Do something good today. Share something on Twitter, is something positive about the ocean. Hope you're inspired after that today. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.